interview with Rosalind Helfand, then hey, this is the part you want to perk up and pay attention to. We are very, very lucky to have this guest this evening. I had the pleasure of meeting this lady with my involvement through the Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance of Los Angeles, and I was put on to the committee that she co-founded called the California Global Biodiversity Working Group. And that is a mouthful, and maybe she can tell us a little bit about how that name came about. And and I have to tell you, one of the reasons I really wanted to get Rosalind to be part of what we're doing here and to be part of this interview series is that it's from I put a lot of time and energy into climate stuff, you know, and I feel pretty good about what I do sometimes. And then I meet somebody like Rosalind, who seems to have like 100 times more energy than I do, and 100 times more effectiveness of what she's able to accomplish than I could ever accomplish. And it just blows me away that she is so effective and so very eloquent and so capable in what she does, that I wanted her to be here because she's an inspiration to me, and I wanted her to be an inspiration to you. And welcome, Rosalind. Please accept my thanks for being here today.
I accept it. Thank you.
Okay,
and I'm
cool.
excited to be here and to join you. But honestly, it's been really, really fantastic hearing what the different committees are doing and your projects, the legislation that you're working on, the global youth engagement interests, the faith-based community engagement, and really just all the different approaches you're taking and committee work. And it's really exciting to hear about this and to see what you're doing, because I just feel like this is the direction that everybody's going in, and sooner or later we're all going to connect with each other. And my hope is that it will really bubble up into something huge.
Yeah, and to that point, it's something you and I have discussed a little bit, and we discussed recently talking about this interview, is that there are a lot of groups out there doing different things that are of a similar vein, and especially in living in something like Southern California, where there's millions and millions and millions of people. We can all be in different lanes with similar goals, and those lanes might never cross. And so I also wanted to mention that you had another event today, and you still made time for us. Rosalind is a curator of a sci-fi writing group, and today you guys had a big event of that. How did that go?
Oh, it went great. So this is actually an annual program that's housed with Lightbringer Project, which is an arts and education nonprofit based in Pasadena. And it's called the Omega Sci-Fi Awards. And we have two different parts of that. One is a global competition that includes the Roswell Award and the New Sun's Climate Fiction Award for climate change thematic fiction, but it's science fiction, but it's supposed to be positively oriented. So really stories of showcasing people overcoming today's problems. And then the other one is a teen competition called the Tomorrow Prize and the Green Feather Award. And that's for LA County high school students. And students write both general sci-fi, and then for the Green Feather Award, we partner up with a really incredible education environmental nonprofit here in LA called Nature Nexus Institute to host that. And then the students write environmentally themed sci-fi, again with this looking for positive angles on that and overcoming as opposed to purely doom and gloom. And this weekend we had our culminating events for both of those. So yesterday we had our teams come together and we had actors read the top stories, and we really celebrated all of the writers, the student writers. And then today, the Roswell Award is a global competition, and we had the actors read stories from all over the world. Our winning story was, one of our winning stories was from a writer in Thailand, and our climate change themed story was from a writer in Arizona who's studying environmental engineering and decided to try her hand at sci-fi.
Cool. Well, let's get right to the nuts and bolts of this. I first want to talk about the CGBWG. Did I get the right? Those in the right order. So tell everybody, for those who aren't familiar, about the California Global Biodiversity Working Group, why you co-founded that, what the purpose was, how that fits into the COP15 that happened in Montreal in December, and really what the mission is and why you felt there was a need for it in the first place.
Yeah, so this actually came about originally because I was doing some conservation leadership graduate work at University of Cambridge, and one thing that I was looking at was why we're failing ultimately to overcome the global biodiversity crisis, which, as you know, is this two sides of the same coin: climate and biodiversity. And we have a lot of individual actions and projects worldwide. And I was really looking at a lot of those that have been led by big conservation organizations, not so much our grassroots movements that are starting to bubble up. And also I was looking at the work of nations, what's coming out from countries. And it's not adding up to a positive tipping point. So we talk about negative tipping points and kind of racing to everything collapsing, but there can also be positive tipping points that start to take us to racing to things getting better, essentially, is what we hope to have happen. And so one thing that I saw was that with the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which is one of the 3 Rio treaties that was signed back in the early 90s. So that's together with the Climate Treaty, the UNFCCC, and the Treaty on Combating Global Desertification, called the UNCCD. So those 3 were signed together. But since then, all the attention has been on climate, and we haven't been taking an integrated approach with those 3 treaties. And what's more, the Biodiversity Treaty kept kind of getting pushed to the side. But what's really interesting is that the Biodiversity Treaty probably offers the most hope for the most comprehensive approach to solving the world's environmental problems, being able to bring together biodiversity, environmental justice and equity issues, climate, and really address those a lot more holistically. So I looked at gaps in being able to achieve overcoming the biodiversity crisis, and saw that one of those critical gaps is that the United States is not party to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. In fact, it's just the US and the Holy See that are not party to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And so it leaves this great big gaping hole in world leadership because of that. Now, interestingly, some environmental organizations who are involved at the global level would prefer not to see the United States become part of this treaty. And that's because they're worried that the US might be more of a negative voice than a positive voice because of some of our home policy issues. My thinking is that it's better to get everybody to the table than not. And so I really looked at this where are our opportunities to do a lot better for the planet, and everything seems to be pointing to local leadership and also subnational government leadership. So states, provinces, territories, et cetera, that we really need to see local and subnational, and we need to empower local and subnational as much as we possibly can. That is the future. That's where the change is going to be. And so I reached out to my personal state legislator at the time, Laura Friedman, in the Assembly, and asked her if she would be a champion of the state of California becoming what we call an observer to the treaty. An observer means that an entity like a subnational government or a nonprofit organization can officially attend and participate in treaty meetings and processes. You can't vote like a country on decisions, but you can be there at the table. And so she championed this. She sent a letter to Wade Crowfoot, who's the Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. And we didn't hear back, but a month later, everything shut down because of the pandemic. So this was January 2020, she sent the letter, and shortly after that, things got a little bit crazy. And so we decided to take it to community organizations in California and some of the bigger nonprofits too. And we started to do a lot of outreach, and organizations like California Environmental Voters and Friends of the LA River and Heal the Bay and Northern California organizations as well came on board and signed a coalition letter. The city of LA also sent in a resolution to the legislature in favor of this and said, hey, Wade Crowfoot and Governor Newsom, California should be at the table for taking a leadership role on global biodiversity. And I thought the process to getting there, to getting the coalition behind this, was a really interesting process, because every time we met with another local California organization and asked them if they would sign on to this letter, we had to go through a full hour, 2 hours sometimes, of let's educate about what this global treaty is. and why it actually is so important for what we're doing at the local level. Why this treaty is setting global targets that we can all aspire to, and that we can be part of not only an exchange between the local and the global, that our hope is that it will ultimately increase and amplify what we're doing, but also because California is such a gigantic economy that by engaging globally as leaders, we can really make a difference, and we can also start to be a role model for other states in America too. So the letter was very successsul. The CNRA a week later said, we're going to do this. We have the governor's blessing. And by December 2020, by December 2020, yeah, so it'd be December 2020, the state officially became an observer to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a permanent status, unless we get booted out for some reason. And after that, we started a workshop series with more and more and more stakeholders from California, more and more organizations wanting to engage. And it just kept growing and growing and growing. And each workshop was a different take on how stakeholders want to see California engaging, what our role should be, how should this benefit Californians, what should our relationship with the CNRA be, what do we want things to look like when the CNRA goes to the 15th Conference of Parties, which is the meeting where all the countries come together for their next big treaty meeting. And it was really successful. And ultimately we said, we got to name ourselves because we're just an informal coalition. And that's where the name, the California Global Biodiversity Working Group, came around, because we're not a formal nonprofit, although that's something we may be going towards now. And we really focused on having a strong presence at the 15th Conference of Parties in December. And we ended up having what we called an extended delegation from the state of California, many organizations present from California, many local leaders engaged too. And we had about 50 people from this California extended delegation show up in Montreal in December, walking the halls of the negotiations, talking to other subnational government leaders, talking to other city leaders. We had California city officials were in attendance as well. LA and San Francisco both had representatives. And it was a really, really big deal, actually, because US leadership, the US is an observer to the treaty, but the US leadership is so minimal that having California take such an engaged role made a really big impression. And California signed on to various memorandums to say that we would work to advance what was agreed to in December, which is a set of 23 global targets to advance biodiversity, climate health, environmental justice. It's called the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's very comprehensive. And now the California Global Biodiversity Working Group is in the process of, we have a steering committee, and we're in the process of working out what our next projects will be in order to help both hold California accountable for what we signed on to do when we were in Montreal, but also how to continue to engage more and more stakeholders in now this implementation of these 23 targets.
It's an inspirational story, actually, to all of us who do advocacy work and, encounter those initial no's that we get until you continue to push the needle forward. And then this is a great example of how something that has made an impact, and you've opened up so many conversations as a result of this. And, I have to say, in terms of my own advocacy work, one of the main benefits of having been involved with the organization is the networking benefit of the other organizations you brought to the table just within California. And one of the really important reasons I wanted to have you here, other than the fact that I really think you're a wonderful, engaging speaker, was also to emphasize to our organization. I mean, our name is Climate Reality Project. And I think at some time there developed kind of perception, especially to the layperson who kind of just follows this issue casually, that, well, the climate thing's really about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's really the only metric that we need to really worry about and carry about, and whatever needs to happen to that. Biodiversity is a functioning component of climate, and it's actually biodiversity, the loss of which will kill us in the end, and not just a temperature gauge, change. That's just one that's a consequence of our inaction. But the true life on Earth is really what we're trying to preserve here in the end, and that's so much integrated into it. It's not a separate, but it is integrated into climate, an essential part of that. And can you talk about the messaging behind that, and then somehow talking about biodiversity and making it clear to people that that is part of the climate crisis? And I think sometimes especially when you're first engaging people, they don't make that connection.
Yeah, so I mean, I often say that the reason why we are fighting climate change is to save biodiversity, and just going back to what you just said, Charles. And I think that a lot of the messaging around that, and I have a feeling that you're all going to be very familiar with everything I'm about to say. So Charles, feel free to stop me if you're like, yeah, we all know this, but I like to bring it, just really simplify it and bring it back to, we need food, we need water, we need air to breathe. Biodiversity is what ensures that we have all of that. And part of the discussion around biodiversity is to say that, we're not just talking about the richness of individual species. What we're really talking about when we discuss the importance of biodiversity is ecosystems that function so that we can experience the benefits of those ecosystems. I usually talk in terms of benefits of ecosystems. My personal belief is that we should protect nature for itself, and that I have a lot of issues actually with speciesisms and just putting humans above other life on this planet. But for most people, it really helps to have this discussion about why ecosystems are essential for everybody on a daily basis, and then really frame that in terms of how we can contribute to protecting whole ecosystems, so that we're not just focused on, again, just a polar bear, for example, even though I worry constantly about polar bears, but that we're really looking at that more holistic view. And I think that holistic view is really important, because we have to be able to have these holistic conversations when we're talking about issues like the life cycle of products that we buy, for example, and really thinking in terms of where are the raw materials mined from, and how do we dispose of it at the end, and why should we be talking about zero waste more than circular economies, for example, and why do we need these bigger systemic changes? Because we have to be able to address problems that are very complex and intersecting a lot more holistically. And if we're able to think in terms of an ecosystem, then I think that can really help us to address these problems better. That said, I do think that for a lot of folks, there's a learning curve, though, for thinking in terms of ecosystems. It's kind of a reorientation of your thinking.
Absolutely.
And I do find, though, I think that it's becoming a lot more common. I think these days the direction is going more in terms of thinking in terms of how issues intersect, and then being able to address those intersections. So one of the IPBS, which the International Policy Biodiversity Ecosystem Services organization, I think that's what the acronym stands for, but it might be wrong. But anyway, you may have seen that report that came out in May 2019 that said 1 million species in threat of extinction. So that report was generated by this global body with about 100, and I think around 140 national parties to it. And they generated this report. And what they do is they generate these different global, what they call assessments on the future of biodiversity and linkages with climate. And one of the big assessments that they have that's going to come out in a couple of years is going to be called the Nexus assessment. And on that, they're going to be looking at the nexus issues around biodiversity of food, water, and other key nexus issues. Health will be one of those areas. And again, I think that's where the thinking is going. And I think that if we really want to work well with a lot of audiences, we have to help them to start thinking in terms of how these issues connect and getting comfortable with it, not finding it overwhelming and uncomfortable.
Right. And to your point, the human-centric argument doesn't hold water with somebody who's really been, heavily involved in this and seeing that everything is connected and everything's about systems. But it actually is a good gateway to a lot of these conversations. And the one upside of that is that, with very, very few exceptions that I can think of, generally the things that benefit humanity are the things that would benefit the ecosystems if we're looking at them on a long-term holistic kind of basis. And when, I've noticed this in a lot of my own work, when you're having conversations about, why it's good to have biodiversity and ecosystems in our local urban forest or our municipal area, it's like, well, there's a lot of benefits to humans from having these healthy cities, kind of a thing. And so you can get people into the conversation by having those benefits being emphasized, and then it emphasizes to them how we're all part of a bigger thing and part of a bigger message, and kumbaya and all that kind of stuff.
And
But
I want to really quickly add that Target 12 of the Global Biodiversity Framework is all about better equity for access to nature in densely populated areas.
I remember,
Yeah, it's a cities-oriented target, and I think that it's really important because I think the other part of the messaging around biodiversity is that we have fundamentally unfair access to the benefits of biodiversity in much of the world. So, and a lot of that in cities, for example, it may be because you have less urban canopy tree cover, for example, and it leaves you more exposed to the effects of climate change. It can be because the destruction of biodiversity along floodplains or watersheds or whatever can leave you more vulnerable to being flooded out, and you have less resources to find new housing. There are all sorts of really key connections between biodiversity loss and inequity. And I think it's really important to be talking about the fundamental unfairness of that as well.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. Can you talk a little bit about how the global pandemic has played a factor in the work that we do as advocates with respect to biodiversity and climate change efforts in general, and where things have moved and how this changes the metrics, and what going forward we've learned from this?
Well, I think that there was a period at the beginning of the pandemic when we were all kind of hopeful, at least. So I work a lot with the global conservation community, and we were so hopeful that this idea of a green recovery that emerged towards the beginning of the pandemic would lead to a lot better funding and effort put into using the pandemic as an opportunity to take humanity in a better direction for.
I'm going to interrupt you. To be clear, this is related to your work with the UN Women Group on the global green recovery, which, if they're not familiar with that, maybe you could talk about that as part of what you're extending into.
Yeah, so actually it's two different projects. So and just to clarify, so what I do for my daily work is I work for United Nations Women. That's the gender equality entity of the United Nations, and I head up their Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition. So with UN Women, I on a daily basis, I'm working with a coalition of people from all sectors and all ages across the planet, and really helping to advance the work that we're doing in a few different areas, including direct access to finance for gender just climate solutions, especially for women and girls at the grassroots level. We work on enabling women and girls to lead a just transition to a green economy, building resilience to climate access building resilience to climate impacts and disaster risks, including through land rights, and also increasing data on the nexus of gender and environment. But what Charles was referring to is this global project that actually came out of the green recovery discussions at the beginning of the pandemic. It's a separate project I lead with several other people called the Global Green Recovery Collaborative. And I'll just briefly share my screen so you can see the website for that. So this project here, the Green Recovery Collaborative, it's a free platform where it's new. So we're actually in beta testing for the platform, but it's for people working in different fields that intersect with climate and conservation around the world to work together. And we have a membership system where then people can communicate. But really it's about making really big global connections and around green recovery. And you can see we have a very global team here who coordinates it, that works together on a daily basis. And we actually have a event coming up next week talking more about what green recovery is and what we see for the future of it. And this is the team doing this event, and I'll be doing an intro for that. And I can post the link in the chat if you're interested.
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I will do that. Yeah, so I think that the pandemic, back to your original question, the pandemic really opened up room for really fundamental questions about why we aren't progressing more, because you know, despite all the debate about a lab versus zoonotic, I think really things point towards zoonotic for the why we had this pandemic, where the disease emerged from. But regardless, we know that destruction of biodiversity leads to a much greater likelihood of more pandemics emerging. So, and of course, the reasons and why the impacts of biodiversity being destroyed both can lead to pandemics and to exacerbate our climate change issues. So these issues are highly linked. I think that some people had a lot of extra time during the pandemic and were able to really get used to coordinating on Zoom like this. And I think that was a good thing, but now I think we're emerging from that. And I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen is people going back to full-time jobs who were previously spending a lot of time volunteering on Zoom during the pandemic and trying to figure out how to deal with burnout and being tired from that, because we're suddenly dealing with a lot more now that we've gone back to regular schedules.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to that point, that's something that you know, I discussed with you recently, and I'd like to get the answer you gave was a really nice answer. So I wanted to bring that to everybody here too. And that was, you know, many of us in the room are involved in quite a few different things in terms of trying to move the needle in terms of climate and other progressive issues and environmentalism, social justice, things along those lines. How did you, as somebody who's extremely engaged, and let me preface this by saying this is true whether you just have a little bit of time to give or you have a bunch of time to give. We all have to make a lot of choices as to where we're going to put that effort, where we're going to put that time, where we're going to put that energy, and hope we get the most out of that energy. Like those of you who come and watch this today, or are watching, and our 1,300 members watching the recording of this later. How do you, somebody that does a lot of this work, prioritize and pick the organizations you're involved in, pick the places where you put your energy, and decide where and how to spend your time that is your volunteer time?
Yeah, I really think about where I can have the most impact and make the most difference. And so where I see organizations that are really hitting on systemic issues, structural issues, the issues where if we can make some real inroads, we can truly move the needle. So to me, that's really important to focus. And I think part of being able to effectively do that means you have to let go of some daily guilt. So I actually have a friend who I went to stay with him for a week, and the first thing he did was apologize profusely for not properly recycling, because he said, I know you do everything in the environment, and I feel so guilty. I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But I asked him if do you engage in anything legislatively? Do you participate in a group that's trying to track issues and move the needle on those issues? And no, he doesn't do any of that. He's really focused though on being guilty about whether he recycles properly. And so I think that that's a bit of a red herring, and we need to be really, really focused on where we can make the most difference, and then showing up and being there. So choosing where we think we can make the most difference, even if it's just one organization that we do something with once a month, but always being there once a month and making that commitment and sticking with it. And I do think it's good to have something that's outside of your job. So I have seen folks who, once their job gets really busy, they kind of drop off anything that's volunteering, especially if their job is already in the environment. But to me, I think it's so critical to keep your finger on what's happening in the community, the changes that are happening, the innovations that are happening with how we organize and lead, and that we have to continue to grow as individuals. And that means we have to put in a little bit of extra time. but we have to stay healthy while we do it. And that means we can pick and choose what we stick with in terms of what our capacity is, and then stay with it so that there's consistency. Because when we have a lack of consistency, when folks that we're relying on to show up to every meeting or report or get a project done and they don't, that's when things start to really fall apart. So do what you feel you can do, but then stick with it. And I find often giving a time period for that can be helpful. So you can say, you know what, I'm going to commit a year to sticking with this organization. I'm going to reevaluate at the end of the year and see how that's going. But give yourself at least a time period for that, so that you've really made a commitment where you can be relied upon, and then you can communicate with others in the group about, you know, this is where I'm at, thinking about making a change now. And good communication really, really, really helps too, I think for people who are volunteering their time to feel good, and then for the other members of a group who are leading that team or whatever the effort is to feel good too.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very, very good information. And you know, I get asked similar questions along those lines too. And one thing I typically respond to try to kind of boil it down to people is, number one, first rule of environmentalism is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, we can't fix everything. It can't all be on your shoulders. You just try to make the place a little better than before you started, you know, kind of a thing. And then the second is that long-term commitment that you're talking about, because you make an impact to an organization once you develop the human relationships with other people that are involved in that similar work, and that can have an impact on the changes that you're hoping to see made. And you know, I sometimes joke to people, I say, find something you're really interested in, make a nice little 20-year commitment of your life to being involved with it, kind of a thing. And that's how you're going to actually see some significant change. And not everything's the 20-year commitment, like you're saying. Sometimes you have to decide my time would be better elsewhere. But we all have to make those choices, and it's important that we support one another and not focus on all that we can't accomplish, and instead choose things that we can actually make an impact on. So
I love the idea of the 20-year commitment too, because I don't know, I remember I led a campaign, and I'm from the Simi Valley area, and I led a campaign to protect some land in that area when I was in my early 20s, so a long time ago. But what was really great is that land got protected. It was hillside land with endangered species on it, and indigenous remains, and it took so much work. It took 3 years to get it protected, but today it's a permanently protected park that's managed by the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, and it's really wonderful. It's you know, nobody knows that I was part of it, but it feels like a legacy nevertheless.
and which area are we talking about in particular?
I'm forgetting the exact name that they gave the park, but it's on the Santa Susana Mountains on the southeast side of edge of Simi Valley.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, it's and I have to say also, there's something kind of gratifying about being able to visit a place that you had an impact on, even if your role was just one small piece of the puzzle, you know, and that's something that's really nice. So I'm curious now to kind of wrap this up, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from our attendees. But I'm curious, going forward, where do you see the most need for advocacy focus in the next 5 years, in terms of where somebody can make an impact and the biggest challenges we have in the next 5 years? We hear a lot about long-term impacts on biodiversity, long-term impacts on climate, and you know, if we don't change today, everything's going to be really bad way down the line. But it's the actions that we can take in the next few years that we have direct control over. And so I'm curious, if you are speaking to people today to tell them where to put their energy right now, what are the issues that you think we can turn the ship just ever so slightly?
I think economic change is going to be critical for that. So anything that can, bills and advocacy that can start to force consideration of impact, not just on climate, but biodiversity in procurement, purchasing, industries that we have that have a huge impact across the military industrial complex. Obviously you were talking about farms. I think agriculture is so critical, but also laws that we have around what we import, and the impacts of things that we import, major industries that produce cheap products on a large scale, like the clothing industry, for example. I think that the more that we can get the impact of these industries regulated, the better. But I also think that we really, really, really have to push funding for transitions, and we have to push funding for transition processes. So for example, part of the effort to shut down oil wells in Southern California, there's been some meetings of communities and oil well owners around and workers around transitioning people who are working in those fields to not be working in those fields anymore. And what does that look like for a transition to happen? Who pays for it? How do we help people to find new jobs? How do we reduce the anger and fear around ending one way of doing things and transitioning to a new way? And I think that that is an area that we can support and pay attention to and listen to legislatively, and we can advocate for that, so that we're not just putting out laws, but we're also saying, here's how we can plan a change. I also think that we really need to be asking for mainstreamed thinking in our governance and laws. So we need to ask for biodiversity to be part of consideration for a lot of bills that we may not even think of as necessarily impacting or being impacted by biodiversity, but we need to start to make those connections. I think enforcement is also a really interesting area that has not been looked at enough. So for example, plastic bans, very poor enforcement that's being heavily flaunted, I think. And that's just one example, but what happens after legislation is passed, and what happens for the long term? And do we have a plan for community relations? And I think this is where this is another area, I should say, where the local becomes so critical, because we need to be pushing this idea of big community relations projects in order to help get businesses and neighborhoods to embrace changes that they're not just inflicted on us. There are some really good changes that are being required. And how can we be working with or helping businesses to make the changes? How can we listen? How can we be not just about saying, I got this law passed, you have to do this now, but get them on board? And I'm really talking here about local engagement. It's and individual, like independent businesses and or mid-sized businesses. I do think when we're talking about big corporate impact and things like that, we have to hit that on a different way and different scale.
Sure.
But again, ground up change, I think, is going to be more and more and more critical.
Yeah, that's all really important elements. And I like that you touched on the equity too, because as systems thinkers, we need to think about the impacts of the changes that we're asking for, and try to, especially the people who are at the lower of the end of those economic changes, and how we can help them to be part of the solution as well, and protect their interests as well as part of what we're doing. So it's all really, really important. Let's open it up for questions now for any of you guys who are in attendance. And for those of you who are watching the recording, see what you miss. You don't get to ask your own questions. But if you do watch this on a recording at any time and you decide you have a question for Rosalind, you can email me through the chapter website, and I'll happily make sure she gets that question. And she's the kind of person that I bet you will send us a reply. So really appreciate you watching if you're at home later some point in the future. Andrew, you got the first hand up, so why don't you go?
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm interested in biodiversity, particularly in Peru on the Amazon River. Mm-hmm. And because of my work there, I'm very familiar with the gold mining operations and fossil fuel extractions and the critical minerals that are being just ravaging. It's getting very difficult now in some of these very, very severely poverty-stricken areas on the Amazon River to just make a living. The river is polluted. They like the river water because that's what they're used to, but it's now polluted. And so my question to you, Rosalind, is what is the best way? The rainforest is so vitally important for protecting biodiversity. what's the best way to get to amplify the political voice of the indigenous people in the rainforests, particularly in the country of Peru, when their political voice is so very much a minority? They don't really have a political voice at all.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Really good question. So the short answer is money. And the more extended answer is we absolutely have to make it possible for Indigenous peoples to engage in global forums, where pressure will be put on countries and corporations to do better. So it's a lot easier to ignore Indigenous peoples when their voices are kept isolated within their territories or within their nations. So one thing that I, as part of my UN work that I'm working on a daily basis, is looking at ways to get better resourcing for Indigenous people, local communities, and grassroots movements, as well as people working at the rural level, essentially. But what we have found is that when there is training, language lessons, mentoring, and then assistance for Indigenous groups who are fighting these battles to access global forums and not only access them, but meaningfully engage, that it starts to make a difference. It's a lot harder to hide when they start showing up to every place where decisions are being made. And in these forums where countries can start to put pressure on each other. Interestingly enough, you would think that all of the articles coming out of Peru about their horrific human rights abuses, we call them environmental human rights defenders. That's the term, by the way, that is actually in the Global Biodiversity Framework that I discussed. I think it's Target 22 specifically discusses that there needs to be protections that countries have to agree to for environmental human rights defenders. And there's been a lot of attention to these really horrific things that have happened, and yet it's still not enough. So I think that it's really critical if we can devote more resources to helping, even if it's one or two. It doesn't have to be a ton of resources, but it can start to be bit by bit, training up Indigenous activists and leaders who are at the very local level to start to be able to show up and providing them the resources. They need assistance to get through the bureaucracy for showing up. They need help figuring out how to get a visa. But once they do that, once they get through, it can make a really huge difference. So I would say it's a really critical area. There are a lot of organizations who are working to help them. There are Indigenous organizations. There are constituencies of Indigenous and local peoples who show up to all the conventions. So they're there. There's just too big a need. They don't have enough support. So the more people who get involved with that, I would say one thing you can do too is engage with one of the Indigenous and local peoples constituencies to the UN Climate Change Convention, to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Find out what they're trying to do and what they need, and talk it through with them and ask how you can support. I know that they're going to bring this up, what I just said, but they will probably have other angles on it too. And it's a great way to engage.
This organization, if we're providing nutrition programs to protect the Indigenous people who are then supposed to protect the rainforest biodiversity resources. So the nutrition programs are great. This is through a Rotary global grant out of Castlegar, Canada. So, and the pandemic has just devastated this work, by the way. So yeah. Everything's in a state of flux now, but thank you so much for your insight.
Yeah, and nutrition, obviously, it's a lot easier to engage if you're eating properly. So thank you for doing that.
The rainforest is very difficult to farm because of the flooding situations, and it's not very fertile soil either.
Great. A couple more questions. We just have a little bit more time here. We really appreciate Rosalind giving us all of her time and all of her wisdom and insights. Anybody else within the group? I see Sherry, you're raising your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rosalind. I wanted to ask the Biodiversity Working Group, is it citizens or is it nonprofit coalition?
It's everybody. So it is individual community members as well as organizations. It's primarily organizations, but we do have a number of just individuals who engage and aren't affiliated with a particular organization.
I belong to several groups, Elders Climate Action, Third Act, and I wonder, are they on board? And how, if not, how can I try to encourage them to formally be a partner?
Yeah, so those groups aren't currently engaged, but the best way to do it is to do an introduction and meet, and so that I can tell them more about what we're doing. And right now we're working on a project, developing a project, I should say, on tracking legislation across California at various stages that would help us towards meeting the global biodiversity framework targets, which I'll post these links in the chat so that you can read them. So after I'm done talking, I'll post a bunch of links in the chat for you. But yeah, I'll also post my email in the chat so that we can connect.
And let's do one more question. Anybody out there raising your hand? Have anything?
Andy?
Andy.
I can do one last one. So again, I chair the water committee. Could you comment on the impact of water conservation, water retention, and just again solving all of the water crises that California in particular has, how biodiversity could contribute to that and solving some of, if not all of our water woes in California?
Yeah, so I think a lot of California's water resources depend on things like, it's not just rain, but it's having a healthy watershed, for example. So biodiversity helps to filtrate water as it comes down through the mountains, having healthy forests. So when you lose your diversity of species, it actually decreases effective water filtration. The other thing is that we should probably be doing a better job of what happens as water flows down towards the ocean. And we should probably be converting a lot more land through long-term projects back into wetlands along the California coast, as well as protecting the wetlands that we have. So again, that will really, really help with the interface between, fresh water and the ocean, but also help us deal with stormwater potentially. I think that if I had more time to prepare for it, I could talk a little bit more about the relationships between things like biodiversity and groundwater. But I also think that there are opportunities in California to really restore areas of the Central Valley, which we know is in terrible state in terms of water across much of the Central Valley, and water quality. We know that a lot of wells are highly contaminated in the Central Valley, and that's something that we really have to be thinking about as well, is what to do about water that's increasingly heavy metal contaminated, for example, because everything's just been so devastated. And I think that restoration of biodiversity may also help us to cool areas of land and to help provide some, in this time of massively changing climate, potentially help us to have decrease heat and keep land healthier. And I'm not going to go into the science again because I haven't prepared for that. But again, it's all about the relationships and how we protect those relationships, knowing that nevertheless, we can't control some of those bigger forces that are affecting us in terms of heat and weather changes because of climate change.
Rosalind, you rocked it. You knocked it out of the park. I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you coming here and being one of our Climate Mover Shakers series guests. And if you want a copy of this, and everybody else who's watching, it should be posted on our website soon and indefinitely for us to refer to in the future and have the benefit of your wisdom. I want to thank you very, very much on behalf of all of us. And thank you for all the work you've done and continue to do, and we hope we'll continue to do in the future. So thanks a lot. And do you have anything else you'd like to add to our conversation?
Yeah, you're still going to be on for a few minutes, so I can add links to the chat. Is that correct?
Please do. Yeah, we have a few more minutes in the meeting, and you're welcome to stay for all of it.